Hello, I'm Rhonda Livingstone, National Education Leader with the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. Today I'm going to be talking to you about documenting children's learning and development. From my experiences of working in early childhood for more than 2 decades, I recognise that early childhood educators work really hard to ensure positive outcomes for children. Documenting programs and children's learning and development is not a new requirement, and even experienced educators need to try different methods to find something that works for them. Gathering and analysing information about what children know, what children can do and understand is part of an ongoing cycle that includes planning, documenting and evaluating children's learning. The learning frameworks, the Early Years Learning Framework and the Framework for School-Age Care, suggest the process of assessing or evaluating children's learning and development helps educators to plan effectively for children's current and future learning and well-being, communicate about children's learning and progress, well-being and development, determine the extent to which all children are progressing in their learning outcomes, and if not, what might be impeding their progress, identify children who may need additional support in order to achieve particular learning outcomes, evaluate the effectiveness of learning opportunities, environments and experiences offered and the approaches taken to enable children's learning and well-being, and to reflect on pedagogy that will suit the context and the children. As happens over time, a number of myths around the expectation for documentation have emerged. For example, there's a myth that you need to write a report on every child every day. Another myth is that links must be drawn to quality areas, plans and documentation. And the best way to do this is to number plans and records or to colour code them. While you may choose these approaches, they are not mandated, and the authorised officers will be focused on how your documentation supports positive outcomes for children. There are a number of websites, including the ACECQA website and the Early Childhood Australia website, that dispel some of those myths, so it's worth taking a look. Another question that often comes up is, do I need a template or a program to follow? There are no mandated templates or programs for documenting children's learning or educational experiences. While templates and programs may be helpful in organising information, they can also be very limiting. Educators are encouraged to resist the temptation to reduce documentation to a tick and flick exercise. Documentation is not about filling in blank boxes. There are many ways to document children's learning and the cycle of observing, planning, reflecting and evaluating. Examples include reflective journals, photographs, videos, children's work, observations, portfolios, narratives, learning stories, the list goes on. The key thing to remember is that it's not the amount of documentation you have or how immaculately or colourfully the information is presented, but how the documentation is used. Ask yourself, how does the documentation assist in planning effectively for children's current and future learning and communicating about children's learning and progress? Another question I'm frequently asked is, what is the authorised officer looking for when they are assessing and rating? The authorised officer will observe, discuss and cite supporting documentation to identify examples and evidence that your service is meeting the National Quality Standard and legislative requirements. Be prepared for these assessments by thinking about how you would talk about your documentation and what you particularly want to show to demonstrate you are meeting the requirements. This is your opportunity to showcase the work that you are doing with children and families in your service. While the Guide to the National Quality Standard provides examples on what authorised officers will be looking for, it is important to remember that the examples are not a checklist, but rather paint a picture of what is expected at the meeting National Quality Standard level. To sum up, there are some important points to keep in mind when thinking about documentation. View documentation as an important part of your work with children and families. Capture children's voices and ideas in planning, documentation and evaluation. Try different methods to find what is realistic, achievable and relevant for children, families and educators. Then set some benchmarks that are reviewed regularly. Be selective about what you choose to document because it is not possible to capture all of the rich experiences and learnings that occur every day. Share documentation efforts and experiences and continue to learn, grow and develop. Be open to change as the dynamics of the children's group or team change. Constantly review and remind yourself why you are documenting and for whom. Make it relevant for the setting. Documentation will look different across different settings. Think about the ages of the children and the amount of time spent in the service. Be clear about what the standards, learning framework and, if relevant, funding agreements are asking you to do. Remember to enjoy your documentation journey and don't forget to look back and identify successes and achievements of your children, your families and your team.